afternoon, everybody. So, we've heard a lot today, or this morning, from Petersfield, etc., how attention and that core long attention really translates then to those commercial effects and effectiveness. And at JCDecaux, we've been thinking for a very long time how actually creative is the starting block to that. You can hold attention, you can see how that translates, but you need to make sure that your creative is working for that attention. And to start to do that, we need to understand that out of home as a medium is very unique. It works differently. It's arguably the last true high-reach medium, reaching 98% of the country. It has high frequency. On average, you're going to see an out-of-home creative 12 times. But you have just 2 seconds of attention, on average, to land what you're trying to say with that creative for each impression. And what we see, therefore, are the challenges that brands and clients relay back to us around perhaps effectiveness for the medium are not perhaps due to weaknesses of the medium itself, but a signal that something else is holding that campaign back. And as we see here on the right, actually a vast number of these brands, of these campaigns, are struggling to land brand when people are looking and people are exposed to that campaign. And an even larger number are then struggling to land positive emotion as well. So something's holding out of home back, and we can start to look here at the creative. So what we did was we created a new suite of tools. We heard earlier as well about the importance of using a diverse range of methodologies, and that's absolutely what we lent into. We looked at 50 out-of-home posters that were actual campaigns from actual brands of different sizes, large and small, and different categories. We spoke to 7,500 respondents about these campaigns, all to learn how to create that perfect poster for that attention. We started with keyword of the century, I think, AI, where at JCDecaux we have a tool called Optics. It uses thousands of hours of past eye-tracking studies, neural sensors to understand how hard people are having to think, and it combines it all with machine learning to understand how creatives are landing attention. We also then partnered with Lumen, and of course Mike Follett speaking earlier today, where we could then expose respondents to those campaigns, those creatives, in a real-world environment to understand where they're looking and for how long. And I'll hand over to Chiara here from System1, who can speak about how we engage System1's metrics in this to further our study.
Thanks, Nick. Right, so from a System1 perspective, what we did with these creatives is we tested them with real people to measure their effectiveness by understanding how they made people feel, whether people could take away the brand behind the ad, and also how good they were at holding people's attention. I'm going to take you through our findings. The first one around attention, what we found is, bearing in mind we have those 2 seconds, right, to capture people's attention with out of home. The simpler, the better. Maximum 3 sections within your out of home we found to be the sweet spot, really. It allows people to take in the message in its entirety. And if you can use bold, vibrant colors, like in this Oasis example, it's all the more powerful because it creates that, the difference between the environment, right? It really pops out. However, if you think about it, you can create the most attention-grabbing poster, you can create the most emotionally engaging poster, but if the brand doesn't come through, then it really is a waste. So you want to make sure that the brand is quite prominent. And we tested branding in different parts of the poster. We found that at the top is the most effective. Logos at the top delivered 32% more brand recall because they align with our natural line of focus. We tend to look at posters top to bottom, and then obviously the bigger, the better, like in this ASOS example. Now, speaking of brand recognition, who can understand whose brand this poster is for? 93% of respondents, when we tested it, got that it was for EE, and they took it just from the brand colours. We measure brand recognition at 2 seconds within the System1 method, exactly because of what Nick said and the 2 seconds that are important for out of home. 93% of people understood EE from those 2 seconds, just from the blue. So really the power of distinctive assets to land branding. Too often as marketers, we think about refreshing things and like we want to do something new, but really the most effective assets are the ones that we use over time that can really drive that familiarity with people. And speaking of distinctive assets, actually, the epitome of distinctive assets are what we call fluent devices at System1. These are characters, but also scenarios that brands use time and time again, right? To the point where they become synonymous with the brands themselves. Puppy, you think Andrex, or, it's the meerkats for Compare the Market, or thinking of a fluent scenario, should have gone to Specsavers, or you're not you when you're hungry for Snickers, right? So these devices are so important because they cue the brand immediately, but they also build an emotional connection with the audience, because we grow attached to these characters. We want to know what they're up to. With scenarios, we enjoy every new iterations of how, Specsavers is going to bring to life their tagline. So they're really, killing 2 birds with 1 stone, brand recognition and emotional engagement. And we know emotional engagement is so important because the more positive we feel towards something, the more we know it's going to have that brand building effect. And speaking of emotion, showcasing faces is another great way of doing so. As human beings, we're naturally attracted to other human beings. They capture our attention. Obviously, you need to make sure that you still support the rest of your messaging. This is a great example of the JCDecaux optics tool. You can see how attention here flows nicely from the face down to the product. Now, faces, characters, especially when they're very expressive like this one, work so well because they're one of what we call showmanship features at System1. Essentially, they're features in ads that speak to our humanity, that entertain us and make us, want to know more about what's going on. These are really good for long-term effects, for brand building, as opposed to then what we call salesmanship features, which are more product-related and more rational. An example would be featuring product in posters. But it does have a place right? Even salesmanship does have that place in driving, for example, what we found, brand. So it helps with brand recall to have a large product featured in the poster, taking up more than 50% of the image. If you think about it, oftentimes products are a key driver of brand itself. So it makes sense that if you have your product quite large on the ad, it is going to drive that brand recall. And what we found is that it also drives more attention and more potential for short-term effects. So on the one hand, you have your salesmanship tools that you use for, that branding, those short-term effects. And then the showmanship side is more geared towards emotion and the long term. And when it comes to copy, what we found is, again, less is better, right? So if you have less than 10 words or 10 words, that is the optimal number. More than that, and people disengage. It's just too much. People don't have the time for it. Having fewer words also allows people to more likely take in the brand, to understand who the brand is, but also fully capture the message, as we said earlier with the point on the 3 sections. If people can take out the message, they're more likely to engage with it positively. We find System1 oftentimes when people react negatively to an ad or neutrally, it's because they don't really understand what's going on. Whereas if they fully take in the message, they're more likely to feel positive about it, especially like if in this case, it's quite a playful ad. Now, call to actions, these are also very important for message takeaway, right? If you think about it, oftentimes call to actions are sort of like the punchline. They help you understand what the ad is about. In this case, you have the message, don't let your specs get in the way, and the call to action, go get, free lenses at Specsavers, is the reason why you have that poster, you have that image and that message. So it's really important that these calls to action are quite prominent. We tested them smaller and larger, and we found that when they are larger, they drive dwell time, but also they drive up that positive emotion because people really fully understand the message. And one last point about the bottom of posters. Now, naturally, that bottom part of the poster tends to get a bit less attention. Again, we start top to bottom, and we might not really take out messages in that bottom section if they are not large enough. Sometimes we get, clients that have really important messages. It might be their slogan, it may be their tagline, their call to action, but it's quite small at the bottom. So our advice there, and what we found from the research, is that they should really take up at least 10% of the space of the poster, otherwise they risk getting lost. Now I'm going to hand over back to Nick.
Thank you very much. So we have our 9 core guidelines there, but there's an extra element that you can add that really drives things further. In a study between JCDecaux and Posterscope, what we found is that the right message at the right place at the right time significantly drives up that mental engagement. That translates into ad recall and then pushes people down the funnel towards higher sales effect as well. And in our Digital Changemakers podcast, where Ian Whitaker interviews experts around the industry, talking to Uber, we learned that Uber really put this context as an emphasis on the marketing they do. Go anywhere in the country and people's engagement with getting a taxi and ordering a taxi is very different. And therefore, they need to build proximity and build familiarity by understanding those unique audiences. And as we're in Manchester, speaking to residents of Manchester, we find that Mancunians are 54% more likely to engage with content that speaks directly to their area. This coming from a study with Group M and Mindshare, asking 10,000 people around the country how they feel about various identifying factors. And that study across multiple partners really emphasized the fact that location is a key word, a key focus of strategy within planning nowadays. We found, for example, of course, it doesn't just stop at Manchester. People in Leeds are more likely to trust an accent from Newcastle after their own, and people in Leicester consider their Britishness, their identity, to come from their dry sense of humour that they think is above and beyond that of the rest of the country. It's all about the nuance of those audiences. But how, then, when we look at a Mancunian audience, a Manchester audience, how does that impact creative results when you speak to that audience? And of course, in the study here, we do understand that Manchester isn't just one big bubble. You can be red Manchester or blue Manchester, and of course, some players do come and go. But what we found then, when you measure this with System1, is that by speaking relevantly to a Manchester audience, that emotional positivity around those creatives, around that campaign, rockets. That long-term brand building, the engagement with your brand because you're speaking directly to people who say, that's my club, those are my players, and they want to engage with your brand. When you then continue to speak to those people, they note that that advertising is relevant to them. And they also, therefore, consider that brand more unique, they're doing something different, and key to out of home, building that trust with people by driving that relevance. But what happens if you get the context wrong and advertise Arsenal to the audience in Manchester? Well, people still love football, of course. You still get those positive results by speaking about football, but you see the drop-off here in that effectiveness by not having that same emotional intensity by being relevant to the audiences, and therefore association with that brand drops as well. And it's not restricted to football, of course, and it's not restricted to the medium. You can talk about your location, you can use call-outs, you can say where your local store is, you can speak about places that Mancunians go, as Tui did here programmatically, but you can also use local language to connect with those audiences too. So, what have we learned in this wider study? We've learned that to create the perfect poster, you need to be simple, drive prominence, be brand bold, and use all of those tools you have in your kit to make sure people know who you are and that you're engaging with them. And you can do that as well by driving relevance to that audience, building proximity with them and emotion. But importantly, test and learn. Test your creative. We have many tools between JCDecaux and System1 through our partnership to test those creatives to make sure that you're optimizing for engagement and then driving that bottom line of effectiveness with the attention you have. Thank you very much.